this is Rick Casells from exercisesforinjuries.com. Today I have another interview for you, and we're going to focus in on the effect that food ends up having when it comes to injury recovery. Now I'm going to do the interview with Anthony, and I'll get Anthony to introduce himself.
Sure. Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Anthony DiClementi, and I run the Exercises for Injuries coaching program. We work with people all over the world that have issues that are related to pain and injuries, joint pain, that want to lose weight, reverse disease, and just overall stay fit and healthy for life and feel better, increase their performance and their happiness. And one of the big ways that we do that is by digging into their individual nutritional needs and any food sensitivities that they may have, any underlying health issues that could be contributing to their pain. And we try to correct those through scientifically proven processes to get people feeling better, reduce their pain, ideally get rid of their pain, and help them lose weight in the process.
Awesome. And Anthony's been following my stuff for years. When I started my blog, exercisesforinjuries.com, way back in 2008, he was one of the first trainers that started following me and, buying my programs, applying them with his clients and getting results. And we've kind of kept in touch. And now Anthony helps me out when it comes to the coaching, when it comes to the private elite coaching for people on a one-to-one basis. So today what we're going to talk about is the impact on food when it comes to injury recovery. So when I started out many years ago, all of my focus was on the physical aspect of it. Doing exercise. Exercise was the solution. And it plays a big key part in it, exercise and movement. But what I ended up discovering, learning from different clients, doing my own research, trying different things out on myself and on clients, and hearing feedback from clients on what worked and didn't work, a big part of the healing, recovery, pain-free process was what they ended up eating. And that's what Anthony and I are going to talk about. So when we kind of look at food, we know what effect does food end up having on recovery? So I'm asking you this question, Anthony.
Yeah. Well, food plays a big role in recovery, and I think you've touched on something pretty important here. I've noticed this pattern over and over again with a lot of people that we work with. In general, a lot of times when an individual is experiencing pain, they're either under recovering from exercise or they're dealing with inflammation on some level that's having them in physical discomfort on a daily basis. It needs to be approached from a holistic perspective. Now, my background was as a certified nutrition specialist and an NCSF personal trainer. And it wasn't really until I started studying the functional and integrative medicine side of things that we realized how important all of these things interplay with one another, and that you need to address the mobility side of things as we do, along with the nutrition, along with the nutritional deficiencies, underlying health issues, whatever those may be, looking at what sensitivities and allergies that person may have that expose them to certain immunogenic, meaning it stimulates an autoimmune response in the body, or allergenic, meaning it's an allergen to that individual, and the importance of addressing those components as well from that functional medicine perspective. It wasn't until we really started incorporating all of those things that results took off for the people. And so now we have built this approach that's really holistic, and the basis of that is the nutrition, and it's the food, because that's what we're eating every single day. And we're spending more time eating and putting these external nutrients, for the most part, when we're eating healthy, into our body. But if we're making choices that aren't necessarily what is going to help us look, feel, and perform our best, that can swing things in the other direction, and it can leave us in a state of pain and disease. So the key here, and the foundation upon which everything else is built, is your food choices, and making sure that you are choosing foods that are right for your body, your genetic blueprint, and that are going to minimize the immunogenic and allergenic responses that are triggered within your cells.
Awesome. Very awesome stuff. Now, looking at, so if we start off with, like, what are some of the worst foods that someone could end up doing or eating when it comes to their recovering from injury, recovering from pain?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, and I'm going to dig into that. I want to take one step back and just kind of address recovery. Under recovering is tied to inflammation and pain. In the same way that an individual that's experiencing symptoms that may perhaps mimic like rheumatoid or osteoarthritis, or an individual that is under recovering from their training, may very well have the same underlying causes contributing to those situations, despite different diagnoses. And there's a lot of different causes that can be triggered by the diet and food, leading to poor recovery or pain and inflammation. And some of those main ones are, as I mentioned earlier, allergies. So people that have histamine intolerance or food allergies. We have autoimmune conditions ranging from a wide variety, but if someone's body is essentially recognizing a protein or a certain compound as foreign, it's going to mount an attack on those compounds, and that's going to cause pain and inflammation. That's going to prevent that person from optimal recovery and is going to a state of pain and dis-ease. There's also gut issues, which encompasses things ranging from Crohn's, irritable bowels, leaky gut, colitis, SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, yeast, things of that nature. Then we see a lot of chronic toxicity, which is just detoxification issues. So whereas like when our cells are functioning at their best, it's like you can imagine the garbage truck comes every morning, picks up the trash, takes it out, and keeps things clean. When that process becomes gunked up and we're either taking in toxins at a rate that exceeds our body's ability to eliminate them, or perhaps we're dealing with nutritional deficiencies that have then caused breaks in the chain of our body's natural detoxification process, all of that will prevent us from removing these toxins to the best of our ability. And when we get this toxic buildup, that's when we also start experiencing pain and inflammation. So we need to also address those toxicity issues and toxic overload. And then there's gout, which is essentially like a defective genetic mechanism in the metabolism of uric acid. So when we eat foods that are high in purines, which the body converts to uric acid, if we have these genetic blueprints that make the processing of and the metabolism of uric acid difficult for us, that's going to cause joint pain and inflammation. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, and as with anything, it depends largely on the individual. And that's why we always start, rather than saying these foods are bad for you as a blanket statement, where because the same food that may cause joint pain or slow down the recovery process for you may not be problematic for me. Now, working with people all over the world, we see a lot of start to arise, and there's a lot of the same foods that are problematic, and those are what we'll dig into. But you never want to just try to put everybody into the same box or try to use the same protocol with every individual. And I think that's why a lot of people spin their wheels, is they spend hours scouring the internet, reading blogs and different posts about here are the foods that are bad for joint pain, here are the foods that slow down the recovery process, and they just try to apply those same principles to themselves, when what they really need is to have someone that's an expert assess their health, figure out what is causing the issue for them based on their unique genetic blueprint, their lifestyle habits and their patterns, and then apply those principles that are based on science and intelligent hypotheses. So that's kind of the way the process works. And some of the most problematic foods, which is now getting back to your question, I just want to take a step back and kind of explain that it's not something where I can just easily list the foods out, because it's different for everybody. But the two most immunogenic and allergenic foods are going to be dairy and grains, particularly wheat, non-organic wheat. And there's a few reasons for this, which I'll get into, but both dairy and wheat, by far, we see being the biggest issues for the vast majority of people that are experiencing this under recovery and just joint pain discomfort. And we'll start with wheat. slash gluten first. Gluten's an interesting topic, which I'll explain in a little bit. I think gluten gets a bad rap, but we'll get into that. Typically, you want to avoid grains that are not organic. Now, if you're focusing on fat loss, there's a whole other animal where grains can be problematic from that perspective, just in terms of the insulin spike that results in the anti-nutrients they contain that can interfere with the absorption of nutrients. But I don't want to get off on a tangent. The main issue with grains is these proteins, gluten and gliadin, which is a part of gluten. And these are proteins which essentially, for many people, have been found to trigger the body's autoimmune response and cause inflammation of the gut lining, which is essentially like I don't know if my hands can be seen here, but if a healthy gut lining, if you can imagine the cells forming a tight seal, and the food passes through the GI tract, and the body has the intestinals have all these microvilli that are able to absorb nutrients from our food, and we have our stomach acid breaking things down. The process is functioning optimally. People take what they need, and the rest passes through. What happens when we consume foods like non-organic grains, particularly wheat, that's the most problematic from what we've found. It starts to irritate the gut lining, and it starts to cause intestinal permeability. So there's this gap that's created, these holes that form in the gut, and they allow undigested food particles to pass through. Some of those undigested food particles include proteins like gluten and gliadin, which is a part of gluten. And then the body mounts an attack on those proteins because it recognizes them as foreign invaders, because they're not supposed to be there. And the result is inflammation and pain that leaves us in this state of under recovery and discomfort on a daily basis. Now, whether or not gluten itself is the cause for that is a big issue of debate. There's a lot of evidence to support the use of pesticides, particularly glyphosate, which is used in most non-organic wheat, and it's a pesticide created by Monsanto. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this glyphosate is actually the key that opens the door to this intestinal permeability and inflammation, which then allows the gluten to pass into the body and wreak havoc on the body, essentially. So it doesn't really matter at the end of the day whether it's gluten or it's glyphosate. The way to avoid it is to stay away from the non-organic grains, particularly wheat. And the reason that we've kind of started developing this hypothesis is because we have a lot of clients that have been diligent about when they eat grains, they only eat organic grains, which don't contain the glyphosate, and they haven't had these same issues. Anyhow, so that's number one, is the wheat and gluten, and making sure you're avoiding those foods. And number two is dairy. And some of the biggest components in dairy that are probably have the proteins, which most people that are here watching this have heard of, which is lactose. And those are two very common food allergens. But the problem with dairy goes far beyond lactose and casein. We also have the hormones and antibiotics that are used on these animals that then get passed into the milk and are particularly concentrated in foods like cheeses and butters, where there's been a process of really concentrating everything that went into the animal into a small food item. You also have issues like genetically modified organisms in the feed of these animals, that, like corn. A lot of the confined animal feeding operations use corn in large amounts to fatten up their animals, and there's been many recent feeding studies now that have linked GMOs to many of today's degenerative health conditions, ranging from obesity to metabolic disease, joint pain and inflammation, intestinal permeability, gut issues. And what they've found is that we are not what we eat. A popular line is like, we are what we ate. So like, the food and the diet of the animals we're consuming, assuming you're eating animals and you're not a vegan or vegetarian, plays a key role in the health of that animal, and therefore our own health, because it all ends up we're at the top of the food chain. If you look at like predatory fish, the fish that are at the top of the food chain have the highest amount of mercury because they've been eating all the other fish that also have been consuming this mercury. And it's similar with GMOs and these pesticides and chemicals. So you want to make sure, if you're going to do dairy, you want it to be organic. You want it to ideally be from grass-fed cows. And you want to be really sure that you don't have a food sensitivity to lactose and casein before proceeding. If there's any doubt, I'll explain what to do in a little bit, how you can tell pretty easily if that's something that may be impacting your health and your under recovery and your joint pain and inflammation. Some of the other things in dairy that can be problematic, there's a substance that's used called ractopamine. This is particularly an issue in the United States. And what ractopamine does is it functions a lot like steroids, where it helps promote leanness and muscle mass in the animals so that there's less fat, there's more muscle, and essentially more money can be made on each animal. The issue with ractopamine is it's a poison that is banned in 160 different countries. One of those, unfortunately, not being the United States. And it's been shown to cause pain, inflammation, contribute to metabolic disorders, obesity, and all of these degenerative conditions that we're trying to avoid, which are all interlinked and connected to one another. So as you find, the more you kind of dig into this stuff, it goes much beyond just these foods are bad for all people. There's the individual component, the genetic component, and then there's also, it goes far beyond just the proteins in the foods. It's more than just gluten. You know, you have the glycophosphate, which I mentioned. You have with dairy, it's more than just lactose and casein. You have the hormones, the antibiotics, the ractopamine, the GMO feeds, the general lifestyle that these animals live, where they're not moving, and the role that all of that plays when we then consume food from those animals, either in their meat or in the dairy itself. Another issue with dairy, casein has been shown to share some structural similarities with gluten. So individuals that have gluten intolerance also often find themselves to be casein intolerant. And this includes people particularly with celiac disease, and they're just less likely to tolerate casein-containing dairy products. And the research, the scientific literature suggests that about 50% of celiacs are also sensitive to milk and gluten. So there is this interrelationship and interplay between susceptibilities to these foods, and it's rarely just limited to one. And I'll go into some of these other gluten cross-reacting foods in a little bit, which are foods that are essentially have an impact on the body that mimics gluten.